everyone, in today's video I'm going to be doing the simple illustration of some rabbits using watercolors and fine liners. Now I'm starting my illustration with a regular graphite pencil, and I'm using a reference photo as I'm working through this piece, and I'm going to be doing the initial sketch only with a graphite pencil. Now while I'm drawing this image, I'm using my reference photo as I've said, and I am paying attention to the details, the proportions, and making them as accurate as possible. Remember, your initial sketch is the most important part of any drawing or painting, because no matter how well you add color or paint to it, if you have anything in the wrong place, like for example an eye or maybe a nose, it's going to show through on the final piece. So it's very important for you to constantly look at your reference photo and try to interpret that the best, with the best proportions that you can get on your main paper as you are drawing. So I'm constantly erasing and correcting things as I work through this piece, as I do the sketch, just to make sure that my proportions are right. I am keeping my strokes very light, although it does come through on the camera dark. I'm not pressing very hard with the pencil. The reason being is because I, one, don't want to damage the paper by pressing too hard, and two, I also don't want to have any harsh graphite lines showing through when I'm adding the watercolor. So now remember, when you are using a reference photo, you don't need to use the reference photo as it is. You can change it to, or however it suits you, you can change it to whatever you want. So whatever reference photo you've got of a rabbit or anything that you want to draw, you can go along and draw with me this particular one or that reference that you have. Now look at your reference closely to determine your the structure of the animal, especially with animals, the animal body, for example, their muscle structure, their skeletal structure. You need to look at all of that when you are drawing animals, and also that determines the values that you're going to be putting on, that is your shadows and your highlights, to make the image look realistic. Another thing to remember is also you need to keep your, when you're adding color or when you're starting to add your values, you need to keep your lights as light as possible and your darks or your shadows as dark as possible, because if that's what makes something look more realistic when you are drawing it, whether it's an animal, whether it's a landscape, or whether it's just a still life. That's something to always bear in mind when you are working. So now I'm still continuing drawing the image. I've drawn the second rabbit on the side, and you can see when I'm drawing them, I am just giving an indication of certain areas that need to have shadows or the direction of the fur. I'm not really going into details at this stage. Now this is just a guideline for me to use before I start working with my fine liner. Now I've decided to do a border around the rabbits, and I just think it looks cute that the bunnies have a border around them. There's some leaves, or not leaves, there's some flowers all around them, as well as the one bunny has got a flower in its mouth, and I wanted to just have a little border so that it doesn't spread across the entire page, and it's only confined to this little illustration in this little round border. So that's what I was intending on when I was working on this piece, or that's what I decided on. Remember, as you're working on your piece, you can decide to maybe stylize the rabbits and or maybe draw only one bunny instead of two. You can do what you feel comfortable with and what you really want to depict. It's entirely up to you. You can see I'm just trying to refine the border so that it completely surrounds the bunnies, and I'm just doing that slowly. I am using a mop brush just to basically brush away any erasings that are on my paper, and then I just decided to add a few little accents of flowers on the top right side of the border and on the bottom left side. That's just to add a little bit more interest to the piece. So once that's done, I start going over everything with a fine liner. Now remember, when using a fine liner, make sure to test it on a separate piece of paper and use water or watercolors over it to see if it smudges, because if you're going to work on your main piece and if it does smudge, you're going to have a whole lot of muddy paint all over your image and you're going to ruin your painting. So always test your fine liner to see that it doesn't smudge when you are working with watercolors or water. Now I'm using a finer nib at this point. I'm not using a very thick nib because I don't want the outlines to be too thick. Also the thing to take note of is that I am using little strokes of the pen as I am doing the border around the bunnies. I'm not using solid lines, so I'm keeping it in the direction of the fur, and I am just gradually building up the form of them, as well as where the shadow areas are going to be. Now, all the while I'm working with a fine liner as well, I am looking at my reference photo just to see if I pick up anything that maybe I haven't when I did the initial drawing. Maybe there's certain areas I need to change, maybe I need to change the position of certain things or add shadows in a certain area, or maybe I missed out something. So that's something that you got to constantly look at your reference photo, even though you're not copying it directly as it is. But because you are using that reference photo and you want your image to be accurate, it's good to just keep referring to it to see that everything is correct before you start going in with ink, and then again before you start going in with paint. So you can see now I am going and drawing in all the flowers, but I'm not keeping to the flowers that I originally drew. I'm changing the position here and there, and I'm adding some places, I'm leaving some out. That's entirely up to you. As an artist, you can do as you please, whatever you want to do. Sometimes while you're working on the piece, you will think of ideas to add on, or maybe you'll think of things you want to leave out, or maybe you want to change certain things. If you can do that at that point that you are at on your image, feel free to do that. And that's just what art's about, having fun and creating images, drawings, paintings that you are proud of and that you just have fun creating. So now I'm going in and I'm just looking at the fur direction. So remember, the skeletal structure of the animal and the muscular structure determines the body shape, as well as where the shadows are going to be and the highlights, as well as the direction that the light is hitting the animal. So if the direction of the light is coming from the left onto the animal, then obviously you're going to have more shadow areas on the right side if it's more on the left. If the light is coming from the right, you're going to have more shadows on the left. So that's also something to pay attention to and to study your reference photo if you're trying to get your lighting correct. Like I don't know if I did mention it, but this is not going to be a hyper realistic drawing. It's supposed to be a fun, simple illustration that you can draw of some bunnies and just interpret the rabbits the way you want to, and just have a fun illustration that's beautiful and cute to look at. So that was my intention with this piece, nothing too technical or too detailed, although it does have a lot of details, but nothing too detailed. So now once I was done, you saw I did the border and I didn't really pay attention to the strokes of the pen as I was working. I let them be a little bit messy, and that's perfectly fine. That's just how I want to work on this particular piece. You will notice that I'm starting to add some base layers of color with watercolors, and once the ink was dry, then only I erased all the graphite, and then I started working with the watercolors. I always start the watercolors lightest to dark, because then you can slowly build up darker layers as you work on the piece, and also make sure that the ink is dry before you start adding the watercolors, and make sure that you have removed all the graphite before using the watercolors, because especially with lighter colors you can get some smudging with the graphite or smudging with the ink if it's still wet. So you can see now I started to add the second layer of the brown, a little darker tone of brown or a darker value. That's just to now determine the shadow areas for the bunny, as well as the ears. I did add a bit of pink. There on the nose I did add a little extra, a little darker pink that I wasn't happy with, and then I just used a paper towel to dab it off, and then I redid it. I kept the pink very subtle, I didn't want it too bright, and then I let that dry. While that's drying, I just started working on the foliage around the bunnies, and also remember I wanted to create a like a bit of depth in this piece. So the background I kept it quite like out of focus, and I did add a bit of a background. So you'll see there's some lines and brush strokes and little spots and markings for the background, just to give the image of or give the impression of there being maybe a grass or lawn or plants, foliage, those kind of things all around them. But I didn't keep everything standard. I kept some as brush strokes, there's some lines, there's some spots, there's just different shapes and textures that I created in the background. But I kept everything out of focus because that's the background. I wanted it to be out of focus and to create more depth. as we move forward in front of the bunnies, you're going to see more detail for the blades of grass and for the foliage. And then obviously I did add details or more definition to the flowers that I put as accents around the borders. So you can see now I am going around all the flowers and adding the green, a lighter green or mid-tone green, just to create that texture of the ground. I'm being careful not to go over the flowers, but if you do happen to go over the flowers, just take a clean wet brush, dab it over that area, and then take a paper towel, a clean paper towel, and then just slightly dab it onto that area, and it should lift the color. If not completely, it should lighten it up quite a bit. So you can see now I just added the yellows to the centers of the flowers, and then I have gone back to the bunnies and I'm starting to add some of the shadow areas and the darker areas for the brown bunny. And you can see I'm adding some really dark shadows as well as I'm blending the darker shadows into the lighter areas, but at the same time I am retaining a lot of the initial layers that I did put on, which was the base layer. I'm not losing that completely. So you see I put the brush strokes down and then I just start smoothing it off with the brush just so that it blends smoothly, and I'm keeping the direction or the strokes in the direction of the fur. You can see with the gray bunny I am also now darkening the areas of the shadow areas, and I am going around the face and as well as some of the shadow areas. Now I'm not leaving the white areas completely just white of the paper. I am going to add a slight hint of some gray like I'm doing now, just to add some shadows and give a bit of definition to the bunnies so they don't look very flat and they have a bit of a three-dimensionalness to them, and they look realistic to an extent. As I said, this is not a hyper-realistic drawing, it is a fun illustration, but I want the rabbits to look realistic enough that you recognize them, that these are illustrated rabbits. So now what I'm doing, I'm going over with some white watercolor paint over all the flowers. Now why I'm doing this is that I just want to basically tone down the line work for the flowers. I want the line work to show through, but I also want to just a little bit soften it out with the white watercolors. Now white watercolors are quite transparent when you use them, so it gives the effect of a slight softening of the line work, but it also retains some of that line work as well. And then if you want to use it more opaque, then you use less water and more of the white of the watercolors. So you can see now I did paint the centers of the bunny's eyes. I am going to come back to the eyes and add the outline or the area around the pupil of the eye. But while that's drying, I'm just working on the little barks that are around them, like maybe there's little branches around them, or they are in a little pot plant maybe, but these are little wooden branches or wooden maybe planks around them. So I'm just painting that in, and I'm adding a variation of browns just to create some texture and some shadows and keep some areas light for some highlights, just to create more definition and interest to the piece. I'm also now going in with some darker greens just to add a bit more shadow areas to the grass, the blades of the grass, the details, the shadows around them, the foliage around them, as well as to the little accents that I added to the border of this illustration. I've even added a little bit of green to the brown of the branch. Now I'm going in with some brown, a little bit of a lighter brown. I'm just adding that to the eyes of the rabbits, and I'm just adding a bit of some more shadows to their bodies, just to give them a little bit more dimension and make them look a bit more three-dimensional. And then I'm going to use some really opaque white to add the highlight in the eye. As you can see, the minute the highlight goes in, it really brings the image to life and makes these little rabbits look real, and like the whole image just comes together. So you can see I'm just adding a bit more shadow areas to the bark or the branches or the wood around them, and I'm just touching up certain areas that I think need a little bit more shadows and a little bit more highlights. I'm just adding a bit more, or not highlights, but a little more shadows, because I'm retaining the lighter areas that I added the initial layers on. and I think we're about done. I'm adding a few more streaks here and there for the background. That's just so that I have a little bit more contrast to the for the bunnies with the background. Just refining some of the eyes. These are things you can determine as you're working and you're finishing up. You can just notice certain things that you want to just add on, and you can see now I'm just adding with the pen. I'm going around the border. It looked very like it didn't look like it was a complete solid border, so I went over with the pen, and then or the fine liner, and then I went over with some a darker green or like a mid-tone green to a darker green. I just went over with a thick border just to completely seal the border and make it look a bit more complete. I think it made it look better by completing that. So I guess that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, don't forget to like and share. Feel free to comment below, and don't forget to subscribe. Till the next one, bye.